started covering the late shift because no one else wanted it. The work itself was not difficult. I monitored an internal support line for a utilities provider, mostly to satisfy regulatory requirements. Overnight, calls were rare. When they did come in, they were usually misdials or automated alarms that resolved themselves before I even finished logging them. The office was a single floor in a converted commercial building. No customer access, no signage, just rows of desks, low lighting, and a server room that emitted a constant, subdued whine. I worked alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. That solitude was part of the appeal. Everything ran through a dedicated VoIP system. Calls were routed, recorded, transcribed, and archived automatically. My role was simply to answer if needed, tag the call, and escalate if it met specific criteria. After 6 months, I could predict the night almost down to the minute. The first irregularity was subtle. A call came in at 12:38 a.m. The system displayed an incoming line, but there was no caller ID, no routing code, nothing in the metadata fields. That alone was not unheard of. Some legacy lines still behaved that way. I answered, there was silence. I stayed on for the required 30 seconds, then disconnected and logged it as an empty call. The recording, when I checked it later, contained only background noise. A low hiss, consistent with an open line. I did not think about it again. The following night, it happened at almost the same time. 12:41 a.m., same empty metadata, same silence. Again, the recording showed nothing but static. On the third night, I noticed the call duration counter was already running when the alert appeared. It showed 32 seconds elapsed before I had even accepted the call. That should not have been possible. The system only started recording after connection. I mentioned it to my supervisor in an email. She replied the next morning that no such calls appeared in the central logs. She suggested the local console might be lagging. I accepted that explanation. Night shifts encourage overanalysis. By the end of the second week, the calls were arriving every night, always between 12:30 and 12:45, always silent, always absent from the master logs. Only my local system showed them, and only in real time. By morning, even those traces were gone. What changed my response was when the silence ended. The first sound I heard was faint and brief. A single breath, perhaps, it was easy to dismiss. Audio artifacts occur, especially on compressed lines. Still, I noted it in my personal log. The next night, there were 2 sounds. A shuffle, like fabric moving, then something that might have been a throat clearing. The sounds were indistinct and low, as if the microphone was far from the source. I spoke into the receiver, following protocol. I identified the line. I asked if anyone was there. There was no response. When I reviewed the recording afterward, my own voice was missing. That was harder to explain. The system captured everything by default, yet the playback contained only the faint noises I had heard, followed by silence. My side of the conversation was absent entirely. I escalated again. This time, IT remote accessed my console during the day. They ran diagnostics. Everything checked out. No corrupted drivers, no unusual network traffic. They told me politely that if the calls were not appearing in the central archive, they effectively did not exist. I considered asking to switch shifts, but I did not. At the time, it felt like conceding something I did not fully understand. As the nights went on, the sounds became more structured. Not words exactly, patterns, rhythms, a pause, then a soft sound, then another pause. It reminded me of someone waiting for a cue. I tested the system. I let the call ring without answering. The line disconnected automatically after 60 seconds. When I checked the console history, the call duration still showed activity up to the moment it dropped. One night, I muted my microphone and stayed silent from the start. The sounds on the other end changed. The pauses shortened. The shuffling stopped. In its place was a steady, almost deliberate breathing. I cannot say why that unsettled me more than anything else. Breathing is a human sound, but it is also a mechanical one. It could have been interference. It could have been anything. What I could not rationalize was how consistently it responded to my behavior. At this point, I began recording independently. I used a small handheld recorder, placing it near the headset speaker. The audio quality was poor, but it was something external to the system. The next morning, I listened to the file. It contained the sounds I remembered, and something else. Faintly beneath the noise, there was a cadence that suggested speech slowed down or stretched thin. I could not make out words, but I could hear the rise and fall of a voice. When I brought this to my supervisor, she listened carefully. Then she asked me a question I had not expected. She wanted to know how I was sleeping. I understood what she was implying, and I did not blame her. From her perspective, there was no evidence beyond my accounts. Still, I insisted on one thing. I asked her to sit with me one night, just once, to hear it herself. She agreed reluctantly. We scheduled it for a Thursday. She arrived just before midnight, visibly tired and clearly expecting nothing to happen. We sat in silence, watching the console. At 12:36 a.m., the alert appeared. She frowned immediately. She could see it. The empty fields, the running duration counter, that at least was real. I answered the call. The line opened. There was silence at first, then the faint breathing. She leaned forward, adjusting the headset volume. Her expression changed, but only slightly. Still controlled, still analytical. Then she spoke into the microphone. The line disconnected instantly. The console reset. No record of the call remained, not even locally. She sat back and said nothing for a long time. Eventually, she told me she would follow up with it personally. She advised me to take the rest of the night off. I never saw her on a night shift again. The calls stopped after that, abruptly. No tapering, no final sound, just absence. A month later, the entire support operation was outsourced. My position was eliminated. During my exit process, I asked for copies of my night shift recordings. I was told they were unavailable. The retention policy had changed. I still have the handheld recorder files. I have listened to them many times. I do not play them for other people. The few times I tried, the reactions were inconsistent. Some heard nothing unusual. Others said the files were corrupted. I no longer work in call monitoring. But occasionally, when I am awake late and my phone rings with no caller ID, I hesitate before answering. Not because I expect to hear anything specific, but because I know now that silence is not always empty, and that sometimes systems do not record everything that passes through them.